They said she was too old, too plain, too strange to wed. But when James Reller married her out of pity, he uncovered a past so tangled in gold, guns and ghosts, it turned his quiet life into a legend no one dared laugh at again. The laughter didn't come all at once. It crept like a chill under the saloon doors, through the general store's warped windows, between poker hands and whispered prayers. It started the day James Reller announced he was marrying Margaret Elwood, a widow, 44. A woman whose name hadn't been paired with anyone's in 2 decades. A woman who wore gloves in July and never danced at barn socials. They called it charity. They called it foolish. Some called it the worst gamble Reller ever took, and that was saying something for a man who'd once lost a ranch on a bet over a horse's bloodline. But James didn't flinch. He'd seen something. He just couldn't name it yet. Their wedding was quiet. No church bells, no bridesmaids. Just James in his best and only suit, Margaret in a slate grey dress that looked like it had lived through every season since her mourning began. Sheriff Mott refused to officiate, said it would be unseemly in his church. So they married in the rain behind the feed barn, with a travelling preacher who charged $3 and left before the ink dried. Margaret said nothing through the whole thing. Not when the preacher asked her name. Not when he called her Mrs. Elwood. Not even when James kissed her cheek like a man sealing a business deal he wasn't sure he'd won. It was the morning. After that, everything began to turn. James was used to waking alone, a lifetime of it, really. Even when he wasn't alone, he'd never really felt another soul close. He expected silence, maybe the soft rustle of Margaret folding linens like some dutiful ghost. Instead, he woke to the sound of boots pacing, heavy ones, the smell of coffee strong enough to punch through a hangover, and Margaret humming, low, sure, like someone who knew songs that had been outlawed long before they were written down. She sat at the table with her gloves off. Her fingers were lined with calluses and pale scars that didn't match the story she told of needlework and garden cuts. A map was spread out before her. Not a local one. Something older. James blinked, rubbed sleep from his eyes, and stepped into a morning he didn't recognize. "You're up late," she said, not smiling, not cold, just observing. "Didn't know I was expected to wake before the sun to be a good husband," James muttered, half joking, half testing. She didn't answer, just folded the map in 4 perfect creases and slid it beneath her skirt. "What was that?" he asked. "A wedding gift," she said. "From someone who knows how deep graves are dug when men stop asking questions." James stared. He thought maybe he was still dreaming, but the coffee burned real in his mouth, and the air in the room felt thicker than sleep. "Margaret," he said carefully, "is there something I ought to know?" She stood, picked up the coffee pot, poured herself a second cup and said, "You married a woman who's been buried once already, James. You don't want to dig her up just to see what the worms left behind." He didn't ask again. Not that morning, but that week, things kept happening. First, the telegram. Addressed to Mrs. Margaret Elwood Reller, a name no one but James had used. Delivered by hand, from a boy who wouldn't say who sent it. She burned it without opening it. James watched her do it, calm as prayer. Then came the rider. Didn't stay long. Just asked if she lived there, tipped his hat, and left with a dust cloud behind him. Margaret didn't react, didn't speak of it. That night, she locked the 8th door from the inside and placed a pistol on the nightstand. James didn't know she owned a pistol. He began to wonder how many other things he didn't know. She went to the cemetery 3 days in a row, never the same grave. When James followed at a distance on the 4th day, he watched her kneel by a headstone that didn't have her name or anyone's, just a blank slab of stone. She traced her fingers across it like it once spoke to her, like it remembered her even if the town didn't. That night she said, "If you're going to keep following me, at least wear quieter boots." James had no words, only questions, and those died in his throat when she added, "I know what they're saying. About me. About you. Let them laugh. They won't for long." And they didn't. because that was the week the bodies started turning up. No bullet holes, no signs of struggle, just faces frozen in terror, as if they'd seen something they knew shouldn't be real. The first was old Curtis, who'd claimed Margaret hexed his pigs years ago, found in his barn with both doors locked from the inside. Then came Abigail Wren, the town's seamstress and closest thing to a gossip paper in a petticoat. She was discovered clutching a book she'd sworn Margaret stole from her. A diary, maybe. No one ever read it. It vanished by morning. James tried asking again. Margaret didn't raise her voice, didn't threaten. She just looked at him and said, "Some things die easier than others. I'm not one of them." And somehow he believed her. He should have left then, should have packed his things and ridden out before the first frost. But he didn't. Because despite it all, the fear, the rumours, the feeling that his new wife had lived 5 lives before meeting him, there was something in her that drew him in. Not beauty, not warmth, something deeper, like the part of a man that aches when a song ends too soon. So he stayed, and the letters began. They arrived with no postage, no names, just lines of poetry, warnings, old codes he'd only heard once before. Back when he rode with men who didn't ask where the gold came from, only how fast they could bury it. James wasn't laughing anymore, and by the time he found the first lockbox buried under the floorboards of their home, containing 6 names, 2 maps, and a wedding ring that wasn't his, he realized he'd married a woman who hadn't just outlived legends. She was one. The lockbox was iron, rusted around the hinges but sealed tight, like it hadn't been touched since before James was born. He'd found it by accident. Floorboard creaked wrong beneath the pantry shelf, and when he pried it up, there it was, waiting. There'd been no key, no instructions, nothing but the feeling in his gut that he shouldn't be the one opening it. But he did. A crowbar and 20 minutes of sweat later, the lid finally groaned open. Inside, 6 names etched on, torn parchment, water-stained but legible. 2 worn maps, one marked in red X's like a child had gone treasure hunting, and a ring. It wasn't his. Not the one he'd given Margaret with his mother's blessing, the one she wore on her finger now. This ring was heavier, older, set with a dark red stone that caught the light like an open wound. He didn't touch. It just stared, then stared at the names again. He recognized one, Rand Coyle. He'd been a wanted man before James was even shaving, supposedly killed in a border skirmish. Supposedly. The second map was worse. It was newer. It had their town, marked, his land, and in thick black ink the letter E scrawled over where the barn stood. He didn't confront Margaret right away. Something in him knew better. He'd grown up with snakes and poker cheats, and men who smiled while slipping knives beneath the table. Margaret had that same stillness, the kind that said, "I've survived worse than you." So instead, James kept quiet, kept watching, kept listening. And what he started to hear terrified him. Margaret had begun going out at night. He'd wake to an empty bed, fire still warm. He'd rise, glance out the window, and catch her silhouette walking into the woods behind the barn, not fast, not secretive, just purposeful. Once, he tried to follow, but by the time he got his boots on, she was gone, like she'd never been there at all. And always, she'd return just before dawn, smelling faintly of tobacco smoke and salt. The next morning, a man was found dead on the edge of town. No one recognized him, but James did. His face was on the parchment. Name: Dalton Krieg. James hadn't realized until then how badly his hands could shake. By the third body, folks stopped laughing. They whispered instead, said Margaret Elwood was cursed, said the ones who laughed loudest were dying fastest, said the devil courted her twice, and she told him not yet. The sheriff tried to question her, but Margaret just stared at him and asked if he wanted to end up like Curtis. Sheriff Mott didn't finish the sentence he'd started. He turned, walked away, and never brought it up again. James watched all of this like a man in a dream he couldn't wake from. He was married to her, slept beside her, ate the food she cooked, and yet each night he felt further from understanding who or what he'd invited into his life. Then came the stranger. He rode into town without a word, face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, scars like claw marks across his neck. He didn't tie up his horse, didn't stop at the saloon. He rode straight to James's property. Margaret was already waiting. James saw it from the window. She stood in the middle of the yard, gloved hands at her sides, head tilted like she was listening to something far away. The man dismounted, said nothing, just handed her a folded cloth. She opened it, glanced at whatever was inside, and nodded once. The man turned and left. James waited until she came back inside. Then he asked, quiet but firm, "What was that?" "Closure," she said, and walked past him like he hadn't spoken at all. But later that night, after she thought he'd fallen asleep, he heard her crying. Not loud, not dramatic, the kind of crying that hurts too deep to make a sound. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just laid there and listened to the truth leak from the woman he'd thought was made of steel. That was the moment James stopped being afraid of her and started being afraid for her. The next day, he confronted her, not with anger, not with suspicion, with need. "You married me," he said. "I need to know who you are, what you've done, what you're still doing." She stared at him for a long time, then said, "You ever bury someone you loved so deep, even the worms couldn't reach them?" He nodded slowly. He'd buried his brother, his mother, 3 dogs, 1 child that never took a breath. "That's what I did," she whispered, "but not in soil." She opened the second lockbox. He hadn't known there was a second. This one had photos, old ones, faces in sepia, eyes full of stories. One was of Margaret, younger, standing beside 3 men. Each had a rifle. Each had the same ring, the red stone one, on their hands. Another photo, a burning building, a shadowed figure walking away. The final photo was of a woman who looked like Margaret, but wasn't. Her twin? Her sister? No. James realized it was her, but different, wilder, untamed. "I used to be someone else," she said. "Before the name Elwood, before this town." She told him stories then. Not all, not even most, but enough. She'd ridden with men who robbed trains, but only the ones, carrying payroll for companies that cheated their workers. She'd buried gold in places only dead men knew. She'd been a wife twice, a widow twice, once legally, once violently. She'd lived through betrayal, fire, floods, and a war no one had written down. She didn't call herself a criminal. She didn't call herself a hero. She said, "I did what I had to live, to protect, to escape, and the names in the lockbox, they made me run," she said. "They're why I became someone else." James asked, "Then why come back now?" She looked him dead in the eye. "Because they started finding me again." The next morning, the general store burned to the ground. Inside it, under blackened wood, they found the body of a man not from town. Pocket watch, engraved with the initials R.C. Rand Coyle. He hadn't died in that skirmish. He'd just waited to hunt her down, and she'd ended it before he could try. The sheriff came to ask questions. Margaret had already prepared a statement, said the stove was faulty, said she'd never seen the man before. James backed her up. They couldn't prove anything. But from that day on, no one dared laugh at Margaret Elwood, and no one asked why the townsfolk who'd mocked her the loudest started moving away, or turning up with broken legs and stories they refused to tell. One night, James asked her, "Are you going to kill everyone on that list?" She looked at him a long time, then said, "Not all of them. Some already live in hell." But James noticed she didn't burn the parchment, didn't bury it. She folded it back, tucked it beneath the floor again. That night, she held his hand while they slept. He didn't dream, not of fire, not of death, not of who she used to be. But he did wonder what would happen when she reached the last name on the list. Because there were 5 crosses next to 5 names now, and one name left unmarked. A name he hadn't read closely before, a name he now realized belonged to a man he'd once done business with, a man James had considered a friend. James hadn't said the name out loud yet, not even to himself. It felt like sin to do it, like somehow, if he gave it breath, it would come knocking. But he saw it clearly. Just 6 letters in thick, dark ink, the last of the names Margaret, had etched on that folded paper. Calder. Miles Calder. James had done cattle trading with him years back. They'd played cards together, lost money to each other. Calder even came to the wedding, brought a bottle of Kentucky bourbon, kissed Margaret's hand like he was a gentleman instead of a man with something rotting behind his eyes. James hadn't thought anything of it at the time, just a man with charm. Now he wondered how deep the history between him and Margaret went, and why she hadn't told him. James wasn't naive. He knew everyone had ghosts. But this felt bigger. He felt like he was sleeping inside someone else's life, someone else's war, and waking up every morning beside a woman who might vanish in the night if he asked too many questions. But that night, she didn't vanish. She waited. When he finally sat down across from her and asked, "Was Calder the one?" She didn't blink. "He was the worst one," she said. Then she told him everything. How Calder had once worn a badge before they were married. How he'd hunted men for money, not justice. How he'd found her after her first husband died and wrapped himself around her life like ivy-choking stone. Margaret said he courted her, flattered her, and then changed. Grew cruel in private, controlling, violent. She tried to leave him, and that's when he told her the truth. He'd killed her first husband, and he'd make sure she never told anyone. So she didn't. She ran. She burned her name and scattered it to the wind. She cut her hair, changed her voice, worked freight lines disguised as a man until her hands grew too calloused to look delicate again. And always, Calder hunted. Slowly, patiently. He wasn't in a rush. He liked fear that simmered years past. She thought he was gone, dead maybe. Then, 5 years ago, he sent her a note. No address, no signature. Just her old name and one word beneath it. Soon. That was when she started making the list. Not just names. Faces, habits, weaknesses. She made herself dangerous. One name at a time. And one by one, the men who helped Calder, the ones who laughed as he hurt her, who locked doors from the outside, who traded her like cattle, they started to disappear. James didn't ask how she'd done it. He could guess. The bodies told their own stories, but Calder wasn't like the others. He was smarter and worse. He enjoyed the waiting. Margaret didn't cry when she spoke of him, but her hands trembled just enough to make the teacup rattle. On the saucer, it was the only sound in the room. "I can't let him find me first," she said. "You understand?" James did. But understanding didn't feel like enough. Not when you realized your wife had built her whole life around revenge, and the man she wanted it from had once toasted your marriage with a smile. James went to the sheriff. He didn't tell him everything. Just enough. Said Calder might be a threat. Said his wife had reason to fear him, but Sheriff Mott didn't even raise an eyebrow. Just said, "I figured he'd show up eventually, like the whole town had known more than James all along." Mott poured himself a drink and added, "You want to stay safe, you better stand behind her, not in front." Then he handed James a key to the jail, Mott said, "in case I ain't around when the storm hits." That was the week the letters started coming. Each one in a black envelope, wax sealed, no return address, just James's name on the front. Inside, single words: watch, listen, wait, bleed. Margaret burned them as soon as he showed her. said Calder liked games, said it meant he was getting close. And then, one morning, they found a horse hanging from the rafters of the feed store. Slaughtered, strung up like a warning. No one in town said Margaret's name, but they all looked at James differently that day. That night, James sat on the porch with his rifle. Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded over the same old ring he'd found in the lockbox. The red stone glinted like it had blood trapped beneath the surface. "I think I was dead before I met you," she said quietly. "You just didn't know you married a ghost." He didn't say anything. He just reached over, slid his hand into hers, and held it until the sun came up. The next week, Calder finally showed. He walked into town like he owned it. Pale grey coat, snapping in the wind, 2 pistols holstered but untouched. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just stared through the window of the general store until the clerk passed out cold. Then he turned and started walking toward the Elwood house. James saw him coming. Margaret didn't wait for him to knock. She opened the door before his boots hit the porch. Neither spoke for a long while. Then Calder said, "You wore red at the last funeral." Margaret answered, "It wasn't yours, so I wore colour." James didn't know what that meant, but he saw how tightly she held the ring in her palm, and how her other hand stayed close to her side. Not on a gun, but near the pocket where she always kept a flask. One with her father's initials carved in it. "You think this ends in bullets?" Calder asked. Margaret smiled, small, bitter. "I think it ends in whatever you're afraid of." He stepped closer. James moved behind the door, ready to intervene, but Margaret tilted her head slightly. A warning. "Let me handle this." Calder reached into his coat. James cocked the rifle. But Calder just pulled out a photo. It was of a woman. James didn't recognize her. But Margaret's face drained of all colour. He handed it to her. "She looked like you." Died screaming. Margaret looked at the photo for 5 whole seconds, then tore it in half. "You always underestimated what screams can carry," she said. Calder chuckled. Then he turned and walked away. Didn't look back. Didn't speak again. Just disappeared. Down the road, horse tied to nothing, waiting like it knew how this would end. Margaret dropped to her knees the moment the door shut. She clutched the pieces of the photo like they were ashes, said nothing, just rocked back and forth, whispering, something James couldn't hear. When he finally lifted her up, she let him. For the first time in days, she let him carry the weight. That night, she told him the final truth. The woman in the photo had been her sister, the one Margaret thought died in a fire. Calder set 2 decades ago. But it turned out he hadn't killed her. He'd kept her alive for years, and only now had he ended her life, just to send a message. James asked what the message was. Margaret said, "That he's ready." Then she pulled a small book from the cupboard, leather-bound, pages yellowed. She handed it to James. Inside were names, accounts, dates, records. It was everything Calder had done, and everything he'd forced others to do for him. She said, "If I don't make it, you take this to Denver. Find Judge Wendell. He's the only one I trust." James asked, "You planning to die?" She shook her head. "I'm planning to end something that should have been ended a long time ago." But James saw it in her eyes. She didn't expect to, and survive this. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Margaret was gone. She'd left only one note. "Don't follow." Not this time. But James did, because he knew where she was going. The old church outside town, the one Calder had once used as a hideout. Abandoned now, or so folks said. When James arrived, the sun was setting. Shadows stretched like claws across the chapel floor. And in the centre, beneath the cross, Margaret stood alone, waiting. A single candle flickered near her feet, and Calder stepped out from the side room, hands empty. For now. James didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. Because Margaret had finally come home to the place where her past ended, and maybe where everything else would too. And in that moment, all James could think was, please, let me take her home again. But the doors slammed shut behind him, and the first shot rang out. The shot rang out, but it wasn't Margaret who fell. It was the candle. The flame blew sideways, spit out, leaving the old church in a low purple dusk as light slipped through the stained glass slits behind the pulpit. James had flinched, heart in his throat, expecting blood. But it was only the sound of war, not yet the war itself. Calder had fired into the candle. For show. For message. I wanted to see if your hand would shake, Calder said, voice thick with something that made James's skin crawl. It didn't. Margaret stood still, one hand inside her coat, wrapped around whatever weapon she'd brought, the other clenched so hard her knuckles were white. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, only tilted her head slightly, like a woman listening to the wind for a sound that might decide her fate. You could have run, Calder said, circling her. You're good at that. Years of it. Changed your face, changed your name. But you came back to the altar. All that time hiding, and you come. Here to finish it? Margaret's voice was low. This is where you buried me. Figured it's where I'd rise. James had seen his wife in grief, in anger, in silence, but he'd never seen her like this, half fire, half stone. Like the heat of her hate kept her upright even when the rest of her body was fraying. I gave you a better life than you deserved, Calder said, stepping closer. You spat on it. You gave me fear. I wore it like a second skin, she answered. I gave you purpose. You gave me chains. She moved first. No warning. No scream. No signal. She just lunged, faster than James thought possible for a woman her age. But Calder had been expecting it. He caught her wrist, twisted hard, and the blade she'd hidden slipped from her fingers with a clatter. Not a knife, a scalpel. Thin, surgical. Meant for precision, not power. Calder sneered. You were always the clever one. She spat in his face. He backhanded her. James was already running by the time she hit the ground, but Calder didn't finish her. He stepped back, looked toward the door James had just burst through, and smiled. Ah, the husband. Took you long. Enough. James raised the rifle. Step away from her. I remember your wedding, Calder said, walking back toward the pulpit. You were shaking, like a boy who got lucky. And you did, didn't you? Married a queen and didn't even know the crown was made of thorns. James didn't lower the gun. I said step away. You don't know what she is, Calder said, voice silk slick. You ever wonder why her trail's got no friends on it? Why the men who touch her vanish? She's a curse, Elwood. You're just the last one stupid enough to hold her hand. Margaret, bleeding from her temple, pulled herself upright. You always did talk too much, she said, blood at the corner of her mouth. Never figured out when to shut up and die. James moved to her side, helped her to her feet, keeping the rifle steady. Calder raised his hands. Mock surrender. You came for revenge, he said, but I've already taken everything from you. What else is there? You never took my name, she said. You tried, but it never belonged to you, and tonight I take it back. And then the trap she'd spent years building finally snapped. Because Calder didn't know that while he'd been stalking her shadow, she'd been laying lines across the territory. People she helped, women she'd saved, men who owed her silence and swore they'd keep it until it was time. James saw it before Calder did. The rustle behind the choir loft, the creak of boot leather above the rafters. Calder's arrogance had kept him looking at Margaret like she was the only player in the game, but they weren't alone. And as three figures stepped out, faces grim, weapons drawn, Calder reached too slow for his gun. A bullet took him in the leg. He went down hard. Margaret didn't flinch. She walked toward him, slow and sure. You remember Josephine Garrett? She asked. The girl you branded like cattle. Her father's up there with the rifle. Told me he'd give anything to see your kneecap explode. Calder was bleeding fast. He gritted his teeth, tried to rise. Another shot rang out, this time a warning. "You remember Lizzie from Candle Rock?" Margaret went on, stepping closer. "She was 14. You told her she'd never be clean again. You told her mother to bury her like trash. Her brothers got the rope." One of the figures dropped a noose from the rafters. James's stomach turned. This wasn't justice anymore. It was vengeance. And Margaret wasn't trembling. She was steady, unyielding. "You tortured me for 5 years," she said. "But I got to live. They didn't. They lost sisters, daughters, friends. And you think dying now's going to square that debt?" Calder's voice rasped. "You think you're better than me?" "No," she said. "But I'm not hiding behind a badge anymore." And she turned to the others. "Not yet," James said suddenly, stepping in front of her. "Wait." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Move, James. You kill him like this, they'll say you're no better. They'll say you were always the witch they warned about." "I am the witch," she snapped. "No," James said. "You're Margaret Elwood, and we do this the right way, or it never ends." She stared at him, and for a moment, something flickered. She dropped the scalpel. James knelt beside Calder, pulled the book from his coat, the one with all the names, the evidence. "You'll answer to the judge in Denver," he said. "And if he's too weak, we'll find one who's not." Calder laughed, even as blood pooled around him. "You think you've won," he coughed. "But you don't know what you started." Margaret leaned down. "I know exactly what I started," she said. "And this time, I'm not running." They didn't hang him. They didn't shoot him. They carried him, half-conscious, through the town. And for the first time in years, folks didn't whisper when they saw Margaret. They didn't look away. They nodded. Quiet. Respectful. Sheriff Mott helped load Calder into a wagon bound for the Northern Line. He looked at Margaret and said, "About time the ghost started bleeding." And that was that. Or so James thought. Until the night the house caught fire. It was 2 weeks after Calder was sent north. James and Margaret had begun to live like people again. She cooked. He built a fence she didn't ask for. They kissed in the mornings. It felt borrowed, but it felt real. Then James woke. To smoke. The house was burning and Margaret was gone. Not dead. Not trapped. Gone. Only the ring remained, set on the kitchen table, beside a letter. "I don't know how to live without the fight," she wrote. "And I won't ruin what you gave me by trying. Calder was part of a web. It's not done. But you gave me a name again. You gave me peace. I'll write when I find more." He searched. Months, but no trace. Just stories. A woman in Kansas who saved 2 girls from a trader with too much silver and no soul. A scarred rider in New Mexico who brought justice to a preacher's grave. A red stone left on the rail outside, a sheriff's office in Wyoming. And always, someone whispering, she was too old to fight, too broken, too strange. And someone else saying, then why is the devil still running? The first letter came folded between the pages of an old hymn book, stuffed into the side of James's saddlebag after a long ride back from Candle Rock. No name on the outside, just a smooth red pebble nestled against the binding like a seal. He sat on the porch in the dark, lantern low, hands trembling as he opened it. He had 3 girls chained beneath the floorboards. I left his door swinging for the wolves to argue over. I ride at dawn. I never stopped being her. I just thought, you deserved the quiet, even if I can't stay in it. James read it 5 times. Then once more, slower, mouth barely moving around the words. His wife was still alive, still fighting. But she hadn't left him out of anger. She'd left him out of love twisted by fear, that she might poison the good she finally had by dragging it too deep into the past. And still, he waited. Still, he left the porch light on. Still, every Sunday, he rode out past the edge of town with a coat strapped behind the saddle and 2 canteens, just in case she needed one. Because even if she didn't want to come back yet, she'd need to know someone was still holding the door open. But weeks turned into months. Then one day, there was a knock at the church. Not hers. The man who entered was tall, near skeletal, with a jaw full of teeth that looked too white for a face that sunken. He had the smell of hard whiskey and bitter dust, and his clothes were tailored, Eastern cut, sharp, thin lines, not a wrinkle out of place. He didn't give a name, just sat down on a pew without invitation and waited until James noticed the ring on his finger, signet stamped with a thorned crown. "I'm not here for a sermon," the man said. "I'm here for her." James stiffened. "Who's her?" The man gave a smile that felt like a hook buried in meat. "Margaret." James didn't move. "You think Calder was the worst of it?" The man went on. "He was a disciple. Not the hand, not the head. Just the hound they sent chasing her heels." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You will." The man rose. "She's interfering, turning shadows into stories. You keep preaching peace, preacher, but she's dragging fire behind her like a comet. She's going to burn every root you planted if you don't cut her down." He walked to the door and turned once more. "When she dies, it'll be your name she calls." Then he left. James locked the church for the first time in 6 years. He didn't know who the man was, but the ring, that symbol, he recognized it. From the old ledger Margaret had shown him before they buried Calder. One of the pages bore that seal. A network, a brotherhood of sorts. The kind of men who built empires on pain and smiled through funerals like they were stage plays. Calder had been one of them. But if this man was right, Calder was just a limb, which meant Margaret was still swinging at the roots, and she might not survive the fall. The next letter came hidden in a hollowed-out Bible in the second pew. Margaret's, old spot. "They killed a girl named Eliza 2 towns over. Said she had visions. She just had fever dreams. But I saw their eyes. They didn't believe it. They just wanted someone to throw stones at. I broke their preacher's hand so he'd know what it felt like to lose the thing you swing from. I don't know if I'm saving or cursing anymore." James pressed the pages to his lips. She was slipping, not away from the work, but away from herself. The woman he knew, the one who folded laundry and hated mint tea and cried during soft songs, was fading into the very myth the world had tried to force her into. The witch, the avenger, the ghost with a knife, behind every smile. He knew she was real, but would she still believe she was? So he left town, left the church keys with young Tom Hurley, told him to keep the candles low and the doors open, took only what he could carry, plus a map he'd stitched together from every place she'd left a trace. Texas, Colorado, northern stretch of Arizona. Everywhere she went, someone survived because of her. And everywhere she went, someone powerful fell quiet. The trail was hot, and then it wasn't. The town was called Fallow Ridge, though it hadn't had a harvest in 3 years. Half the storefronts were closed, the school boarded up, but the saloon was still open, and the piano still played. James found her behind the bar, hair cut short, eyes sharper than ever. She wore no name, but when he sat down, she didn't flinch. "You're late," she said. "You're hard to follow." She poured 2 drinks, didn't ask if he wanted one. Just slid it over and leaned on the wood. "They're hunting me now," she said. "Not just their dogs, the heads, the fathers, the ones whose names don't show up in ledgers. I know. They sent one to your church. Tall. Looked like a vulture in a velvet coat. I know." "He say anything before he left?" James nodded. "He said when you die, it'll be my name you call." Margaret looked away, not in shame, not in fear, in something deeper, like grief, but not for herself. "I'm not dying," she said. "Not yet, but I don't think there's a place for me to come back to anymore." "There is." She turned to him, slower this time. "I don't need you to follow me. I know. I don't need you to fix me. I couldn't." She was quiet. A moment longer. then whispered, "I just don't want to forget who I was before all this." And James reached across the bar, took her hand. "You were mine," he said, "and you still are." She didn't cry, but her fingers curled around his, like they were the only thread keeping her from unraveling. They left that night, together, not for home, for war. Because Margaret had uncovered something in Fallow Ridge, papers hidden in the mayor's office, bound in twine, stamped in that same signet seal, names, orders, contracts for disappearances dressed up as accidents, a whole syndicate of men who passed women between them like livestock, stamping down anything that didn't stay quiet. They had a compound 2 days north, tucked in the hills. Margaret had been waiting for someone to help her get in. She just hadn't. Expected it to be her husband. "Tell me why this is different," James said as they rode. "You've burned a lot of rot out of this land already." "Because this is where it started," she answered. "Before Calder, before the Brands, before they taught little girls that silence was safer than truth." They reached the hills, by sundown on the second day. Smoke rose from chimneys. Horses lined the pens. A fence tall enough to gut a man rimmed the whole property. But Margaret didn't flinch. "We go tonight," she said. "We don't even know how many men they've got." "We know enough." James almost smiled. "You always were the stubborn one." "I learned from the best. They waited for dark, and when the stars came out, they burned the place down. But not before dragging every record out into the dirt. Not before setting the men in a circle and forcing them to watch the names rise like ashes. You remember these women?" Margaret asked. "Because they remember you." One of the men spit at her. She let him, then pulled the letter from her pocket, the one she'd written to Eliza's mother, folded it, set it at his feet. "They remember what you did," she said, "and now everyone else will too." James didn't stop her, because this time it wasn't about vengeance. It was about memory and what it costs to carry it alone. As dawn broke, Margaret stood at the ridge and watched the smoke trail east. James came up beside her. "You done?" "No," she said. "But I think I can rest." They rode back in silence, not to town, to a cabin on the edge of nowhere, where no one asked questions and the wind sounded like peace. But the war wasn't over, because a week later a rider came, hat in hand, eyes shaking. "There's a name scrawled on every saloon door from here to Missouri," he told her. "They're calling you the Widow Witch, the one who won't die. They're scared." And Margaret Elwood finally smiled. "Good," she said, "let them be." The name Widow Witch travelled faster than fire in a dry wind. Saloon doors whispered it. Trading posts scribbled it on walls just above reward posters. Most thought it was legend. Some furious spirit stirred from the grave of injustice. But others, those who had run from towns with the stench of guilt still fresh on their skin, they knew better. They knew her face. They remembered the cold edge in her eyes. They remembered what it felt like to be judged not by the law, but by the woman they'd left screaming in the dirt long ago, and to have that judgment return with spurs, dust, and flame. Margaret Elwood never meant to become a name. She had only wanted to stop hiding, to walk into the light without having to flinch. But justice, once starved, doesn't ask for crumbs. It devours. James saw it too. Saw how each victory twisted her shoulders tighter, how each man exposed added another brick to the weight she carried. They had burned the compound in the hills, freed 3 women locked in the cellar beneath it, found forged marriage records, receipts for auctions disguised as travel fares, and letters from men congratulating each other for how clean the whole operation had stayed. And that was the last straw. For the men behind the curtain, the ones who had worn soft gloves and silver watches while others did their bleeding, it meant their secrets were bleeding into the world. They didn't send messengers anymore. They sent killers. The first came at dawn. A rifle shot through the window of their cabin missed James's head by inches. The second came at night. Poison in the water bucket. But Margaret had tasted enough. bitterness to know something was wrong before the first sip. And the third, he came smiling, posed as a preacher, asked if they'd seen a lost boy. Margaret opened the door just long enough to press a pistol to his ribs and say, "You're not the first man who thought a Bible could hide your sins. He left alive." Barely. After that, they moved again, this time to a canyon town called Rowan's Bend, where the sheriff was a woman with scars beneath her eyes and a son she taught to shoot straight before she taught him how to read. Her name was Clara Mace, and when Margaret arrived, Clara didn't flinch. "I've been expecting you," she said, arms crossed at the edge of the jailhouse. "Town's clean, mostly, except for the banker. He's been laundering land deeds, kicking widows, off plots, and reselling them to Eastern railmen. Ain't had the muscle to stop him." Margaret only nodded. "Then you do now." For the first time in weeks, Margaret and James slept in a bed that didn't creak with fear. He watched her that night, watched her with her back to the door like always, but softer somehow. She no longer woke with her hand on a blade. She was still a storm, but the winds were slower. Stillness, he thought, even if temporary, stillness was a kind of mercy. The next morning, the banker's office was empty. He'd left in the night. Margaret followed, found him hiding 2 towns over, disguised as a tanner. Dragged him back by the collar and made him write every stolen name in the ledger before handing him over to Clara. And for a moment, it almost felt like the tide was turning. But then came the letter, sealed with red wax and pressed into the door of the sheriff's office. It had no name, no sender, just a single page, written in delicate, careful script. She once wore a mask of gentleness. Now she's learned she doesn't need it. She thinks she's changed the game. But we still own the board. If she takes another step, we won't kill her. We'll burn every town she's ever touched. And we'll start with yours. Clara read it twice, then looked to Margaret. "They don't bluff," she said. "I know. They're saying they'll kill me. My boy." "I know," Margaret whispered. James saw the war behind her eyes. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even fear. It was a kind of violent resolve, the kind that tears itself apart to keep someone else whole. But this time, James stepped forward. "No," he said. "You don't get to run from this one. We're not moving, not again. If they want fire, we'll give it to them." Clara nodded. "We'll stand." The town gathered that night in the chapel, not for prayer, for truth. Margaret told them everything, names, towns, the crimes she'd witnessed, the men who now hunted her. Some gasped. Others stared in silence. One woman broke down in the back pew and said, "They took my sister. I thought I was crazy for remembering it." But not one person left. The next morning, Rowan's Bend changed. Boards went up on windows, not out of fear, but as fortification. Rifles were cleaned. Traps laid. Clara deputized every able soul, and Margaret stood at the center of it all, no longer just the myth in the dust, but the eye of the storm. 3 days later, the riders came. 12 of them, all dressed in black. Margaret watched from the church steps. "They'll kill everyone," James whispered. "Not if we remind them we're not ghosts," Margaret answered. "We're witnesses, and you don't kill a witness without everyone asking why." When the first rider stepped forward, he held out a torch. "Last chance," he called. "Give us the witch. Walk away alive." Margaret stepped down. "Tell me your name," she said. "Or is it easier to kill when you stay anonymous?" The man smirked, but behind him, one of the other riders shifted. Nervous, Margaret saw it, seized it. "You, second from the left," she said. "You were in Haylock. You guarded the train yard. You watched a girl scream for help, and you did nothing. You think I forgot?" He froze. The lead man turned. "Shut up." But Margaret kept going. "You remember her name? Elsie Gray. Her blood was still warm when I found her. Now the second rider looked sick." "I didn't," he started. "You didn't help," Margaret said. "That's enough." The town bristled, and the riders saw it. This wasn't going to be easy. The lead turned back. "Burn it!" And they charged. But the townsfolk were ready. Clara fired the first shot, straight through the wheel of their supply cart, flipping it into the dirt and blocking the pass. A dozen rifles cracked after. Smoke, screams. James tackled one rider off his horse while Margaret ran for the church bell, rang it once, twice, and on the third chime, the hidden sharpshooters on the ridge revealed themselves. It wasn't war, it was justice, and when the dust cleared, 3 riders lay dead. 2 had fled. The rest lay wounded, bound, begging for mercy they'd never once offered their victims. Clara approached Margaret. "Is it over?" Margaret looked at the lead rider, now gagged, hands tied to the rail post. "Not yet," she said. She went inside the church, returned with a book, the ledger from the compound, opened it to the page bearing the thorned seal, held it up. "This. Man's name is Wallace Crane," she said. "He signed off on 5 auctions, including a girl named Mary, age 13. He once wrote, 'Fear is cheaper than a gun' in the margins of a letter to his brother. I don't need to read you the rest. You already know who he is." Crane flinched. "But now," Margaret said, "the world will know too." She turned, handed the ledger to Clara. "Make copies. Send them east. Newspapers. Courts. Let them try to deny it." Clara nodded. "What about him?" Margaret looked back to Crane, and for once her voice was calm. "Let him live. He'll rot longer that way." The town cheered, and as night fell, they lit lanterns on every doorstep, not in mourning, but in defiance. Margaret stood beside James, her hand in his, and the firelight made her look younger, somehow, or maybe just unburdened. "You did it," James said. "No," she whispered. "We did." But even as the town sang and danced, as children laughed and women wept in relief, Margaret's eyes stayed fixed on the ridge, because the war wasn't done. This battle had only made her louder, and somewhere in the east, the ones who truly pulled, the strings, the men whose faces never appeared in ledgers, whose crimes were committed with ink and gold, were watching. She'd stirred the hornet's nest, and they were coming. But so was she. The letters came 3 days after the gunpowder settled. 3 identical envelopes, no return address, each delivered to a different home in Rowan's Bend. One to Clara Mace, one to the widow who'd stood up first in the church, and one, hand-delivered, by a trembling stagecoach boy, to Margaret Elwood herself. The handwriting on the outside was graceful, slanted, and far too calm for what it carried. Inside, only 2 words. Next time. Not "we'll try again." Not "you'll pay." Just next. Time, as if it were already decided, as if they'd already seen the shape of her end, and were simply counting down until they could make it so. But Margaret had lived under threat long enough to know the difference between a warning and a promise. This was neither. This was theatre, a paper mask for cowards too rich to get their hands dirty, too vain to admit they'd already lost control. The ledgers had been copied. Clara had sent them east, west to papers and judges, and even to an abolitionist print house up in St. Louis that promised to make the story its front page. Wallace Crane was already shackled in Clara's jail, waiting for the next federal marshal who dared come through town. And every night, more letters came from towns Margaret had never set foot in, from women she'd never met, telling their stories, thanking her, asking if they could help. She'd pulled back the curtain, and it turned out there were hundreds of hands just waiting for someone to do it first. But that didn't make her safe, just louder, and louder things were harder to ignore. James knew it too. He'd watched her change day by day, not harden. She'd already been forged, but unfold. The quiet way she took over a room now, not with fury, but with expectation. The way her words found corners of people's hearts. Even they didn't know existed. He'd loved her when he thought she was just a woman who survived. Now, he loved her because she refused to be anything less than a reckoning. Still, he feared what came next, because the higher she rose, the more the world would try to drag her down. And they wouldn't always send riders with rifles. Some attacks came wearing silk gloves and smiling mouths. One did, not a week later. He arrived in town wearing a preacher's collar and carrying a leather satchel filled with Bibles. Said his name was Reverend Fincher, that he was passing through on his way to visit a cousin near Tull Creek. Clara was suspicious, but he showed a real ordainment document, proper ink and wax, and the letter of transit bore the governor's seal. He even preached a short sermon the following Sunday, soft-spoken, poetic, just the kind of balm a wounded town needed after a war. But Margaret didn't sit in the pews. She stood in the back, watched his hands, the way they didn't tremble when he read from the Book of Ruth, the way he kept looking toward her without really looking at her. And when the sermon ended and folks went to shake his hand, she stayed put. He noticed. And that evening, as twilight soaked the streets in copper, he knocked on the door of the cabin she and James had repaired. James opened, didn't move aside. The preacher only smiled. Just a short word. I think the Lord may have brought me here for more than comfort. Margaret stepped behind James. I think the Lord already knows what I've done, she said. But go on, say your piece. Fincher removed his hat, took a breath. You've stirred up something big, bigger than you know. They're not scared of you. Not really. They're scared of the idea of you. Margaret didn't blink. Good. But that kind of fear, he said softly, breeds hunger. They'll want your blood to be the price for peace. Then they'll come get it themselves, James said. But Fincher only shook his head. They won't. They'll find someone like me, someone you might listen to, someone who looks harmless, someone to try to bargain. Margaret stepped forward. Are you bargaining? No, he said. I'm warning. And then he left. But that night, as Margaret sat by the fire with James, she took out the journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The one with all the names. Not just the guilty, but the ones who helped her, sheltered her, believed her when no one else did. And she began writing again. This time, not names, instructions. Because if she fell, someone would need to pick up the torch. She gave the journal to Clara the next morning. If I'm taken, she said, don't waste time mourning. Read this. Follow it. Clara tried to argue, but Margaret only smiled. Hope is fragile, but it travels faster than fear. Then she kissed James, held his hand longer than usual, and they waited. The next week passed in silence, but it wasn't the calm before the storm. It was the storm pretending to be calm, because one morning, just as the sun began bleeding over the ridge, a rider arrived from St. Louis. Exhausted, dust-covered, he found Clara first, handed her a letter with trembling fingers. From the paper, he said. Thought you ought to see. Clara read it, then ran. By the time she reached Margaret's door, James was already on the porch, shotgun in hand. Margaret took the paper, read the headline, then stared. The front page bore her name, her real one. Not the myth, not the widow, just Margaret Elwood. And beneath it, accused murderess reignites vigilante violence in the West. The article painted her as a manipulator, said the ledger was forged, claimed she had coerced Wallace Crane, said she'd been connected to a string of unexplained deaths across 5 territories. And worst of all, it was signed by a federal prosecutor, the same man who once dined with the men she'd exposed. Forgery, Clara spat. They're going to try her. They don't want a trial, James said. They want a noose. But Margaret just folded the paper. They want a theatre. I'll give them one. She turned to Clara. Help me ride east. Clara frowned. You sure? If I run, I become their story. James shook his head. We can find a safe town. No, Margaret said, soft but firm. If I disappear, they win. And so they rode. Margaret, James, Clara, and 5 volunteers from Rowan's Bend. They carried the real ledgers, the real letters. And when they reached the courthouse steps in St. Louis, Margaret walked straight into the lion's mouth. The trial was set for 3 weeks later. Every paper called it the trial of the widow witch. Some thought it'd be over in a day, but Margaret stood before the judge and told every truth she'd carried for years. Clara presented the ledger. James swore to her innocence, and on the third day, the girl named Marie, who they'd freed from the cellar, took the stand. When she finished her story, there wasn't a dry eye in the gallery. The jury didn't even leave the room. They found Margaret not guilty on all charges, but the real victory came afterward, because people began to write, from states away, women, men, widows, daughters. They told their own stories. Some signed their names, some didn't, but each letter echoed one thing. You reminded us we're not crazy, we're not broken, we're just not alone anymore. Margaret didn't go back to Rowan's Bend right away. She and James stayed in St. Louis, started a print, house, published stories from the silenced. Not all were dramatic, some were simple, but each one was a stone in the wall she was building. One no threat, no smear campaign, no rider in the dark could break. And sometimes at night, James would catch her staring out the window, still and quiet. He once asked her if she missed the fire. She shook her head. The fire never leaves. I've just stopped letting it burn me. One day, a letter arrived addressed to the widow witch. No return. Just a single sentence inside. You won't stop us. Margaret smiled, tossed it into the fireplace, and wrote 3 new names in her journal. Because now the world knew who she was, and more importantly, so did she.